Sherlock Holmes and the Whitechapel Murders by Ngamoko Nikora. Chapter 1. Shadows of the Past. It had been several weeks since Tom, Mark and Tipo helped Sherlock Holmes unravel the mystery of Milburn Manor and the haunting of Lady Milburn. Life had returned to normal, but the excitement of their last adventure lingered in their minds. One rainy afternoon, Tom alluded to a darker story that had been circulating in the newspapers, one that demanded their attention. "Have you read about the recent string of murders in Whitechapel?" Tom asked, his eyes glinting with intrigue. "They're calling it the work of a serial killer." "Of course, it's been all over the papers," Mark replied, leaning forward, "but they haven't caught anyone. Can you imagine the fear that must be settling over the streets?" "If only Holmes would take this case," Tipo said wistfully. "We should pay him a visit and see what he thinks." With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, the three friends decided to head to Baker Street. Whatever awaited them, they knew they were ready for a challenge. Chapter 2. Back to Baker Street. The familiar creak of the door to 221B Baker Street was a welcomed sound as they entered, greeted by the heady aroma of pipe tobacco and old books. Holmes was deep in thought, pacing the room while poring over a series of newspaper clippings spread across his desk. "Ah, my young friends, what brings you back so soon?" Holmes asked, glancing up with keen interest. "We wanted to discuss the murders in Whitechapel," Tom said, his voice steady. "Everyone is panicking, and we thought you might want to investigate." "Indeed, I have been studying the case myself," Holmes replied, his eyes glinting with determination. "The press calls the murderer Jack the Ripper. The brutality of the crimes suggests a calculated and elusive killer." Mark leaned closer. "Do you have any leads?" "None that are conclusive yet," Holmes admitted, "but we must act swiftly. There are patterns in the incidents that point to something greater. Are you willing to assist me?" The boys exchanged excited glances. "Absolutely," they said in unison. Chapter 3. The crime scene. The dreary streets of Whitechapel were starkly different from the elegance of Baker Street. As they made their way through the fog-laden alleyways, the atmosphere felt heavy with a blend of curiosity and dread. The sights and sounds of the bustling market life faded as they approached the site of their latest crime. The alley where the body was discovered was cordoned off, a vivid reminder of tragedy amongst the ordinary life surrounding it. Police officers were present, but they gave way to Holmes and his young companions as they approached the scene. "It is essential for us to examine the surroundings," Holmes instructed. "Look for anything that seems out of place. A sign, an object, a clue." Tom surveyed the area, noting a blood stain that had not yet been scrubbed away. "This was quite recent," he observed, pointing. The dark red contrasted with the grey stones. Mark crouched to inspect a small piece of fabric caught on the edge of a brick. "This looks like part of a woman's dress," he said softly, lifting it gingerly. Holmes leaned down to examine it, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Indeed, this could be a critical piece of evidence." "Could it belong to the victim?" Tipo asked, a dark realization setting in. "Possibly," Holmes replied, standing up straight, "but we must find out if it matches the clothing of the deceased. We should head back to the local constabulary for further investigation." Chapter 4. the constabulary's dark secret. At the local police headquarters, they met with Inspector Lestrade, a stout man with a wary expression. "Holmes, I wish you wouldn't show your face around here," Lestrade grumbled. "The press is in a frenzy over this case, and we're making no progress." "This is precisely why I'm here," Holmes replied smoothly. "We need to discuss the victim and your investigation." As Lestrade relayed the details of the murders, the boys took notes, their pulse quickening with the gravity of each account. Each victim had been found brutally slain with gruesome precision, and their bodies displayed in a shocking manner. "The killer is taunting us," Lestrade concluded, glancing at the young friends. "It's as if he enjoys watching us flounder." Holmes fixed Lestrade with a piercing gaze. "What have I told you that the key to solving this might lie in the victims' relationships? We must explore their social circles and delve into their pasts. There could be connections we're missing." "And what of this piece of fabric?" Tom interjected, placing it on the table. Lestrade examined it carefully. "It does resemble the style. The victim was a woman named Mary Ann Nichols, known to frequent local establishments." "Then our next move is clear," Holmes said. "We must go to the places she visited and speak with her acquaintances." Chapter 5. The Dark Underbelly of Whitechapel. The trio, alongside Holmes, descended into the shadows of Whitechapel's pubs, where the lingering scent of stale ale and smoke hung heavily in the air. Each establishment seemed to harbour its own secrets, and the atmosphere shifted with the sound of their boots on the worn wooden floors. As they entered a crowded tavern, Holmes led the way, scanning the room for familiar faces. "We are looking for anyone acquainted with Mary Ann Nichols," he called to the innkeeper. "Mary? She was a regular here, poor thing," the innkeeper replied, a note of sadness in his voice. "She usually sat at that table in the corner. She'd talk to anyone who'd listen." The group made their way to the table, where remnants of her presence lingered. Tom noticed a folded piece of paper beneath the table and retrieved it, opening it to reveal a letter filled with scribbles. "What did you find?" Mark asked, leaning in. "It seems to be a note. Perhaps a love letter," Tom speculated. Holmes gently took the letter, scrutinizing the handwriting and the words. "This is intriguing," he said, adopting a pensive expression. "It's not just from a suitor. It speaks of desperation and longing. There's something deeper at play here." As they questioned the patrons, they learned of Mary's turbulent relationships and her struggle against the poverty of the district. She had spoken of meeting a man who promised her a brighter future, but went mysteriously missing shortly before her death. Chapter 6. Pursuing a Lead. Equipped with new knowledge, the group ventured deeper into Whitechapel, chasing leads that pointed towards Mary's acquaintances. They found themselves at a nearby lodging house, where they asked questions of a landlady. "She was troubled, always coming and going," the landlady stated, wringing her hands. "But she had a visitor, a gentleman in fine clothing, who seemed far too good for her." Holmes replied, "Did you catch this name?" "No, but I remember he had a distinct accent. Dapper, with dark hair," she replied. "Can you describe the gentleman more?" Tipo asked eagerly. The landlady paused, her brow furrowing in thought. He always had flowers and a silver watch, very particular about his appearance. Quite the description, Holmes mused, writing notes. We may be able to track him down. Chapter 7. A Fatal Encounter. As they pieced together Mary's story, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the streets. The boys and Holmes returned to Baker Street to regroup and reflect on their findings. Everything points to a predatory nature, Tom said, pacing. It's as if she was targeted and manipulated. Mark shifted uneasily in his seat. But what happens if we find this man? What if he's dangerous? Danger is an inescapable part of this pursuit, Holmes replied, his tone grave. But we must act carefully. Our inquiry thus far hints at malice, but we must gather more evidence before confronting anyone. Just then, Mrs. Hudson entered with alarming news. Mr. Holmes! Mr. Holmes! The police are on the way. They say another murder has occurred. An electric silence fell over the group. Holmes turned serious. We must head to the scene immediately. Chapter 8. The Grim Discovery. Arriving at the scene, the air was thick with despair. Police officers barred the entrance, but Holmes continued forward with the young friends close behind. They were met with the sight of yet another body, a woman whose suffering was etched darkly across her face. Another victim, Lestrade muttered, his voice choked with frustration. Holmes crouched down to examine the scene, noting the details, the positioning of the body, the surrounding debris, and the clues left behind. This is not just a murder, it is a grotesque statement, he proclaimed, shifting his focus to the victim's clothing. She had suffered in life, now in death. Her agony is mocked. Tom glanced toward the corner, spotting the watch that resembled what the landlady had described from earlier on. Holmes, look, that watch on the ground. Holmes turned sharply, recognizing the silver chain glinting in the flickering light. It seems our gentleman has left behind a calling card. But whose watch is it? Could it belong to the man who visited Mary? Tipo suggested, his brows furrowing together. Only one way to find out, Holmes said grimly. Chapter 9. The chase begins. Returning to Baker Street, the mood was tense yet determined. Each piece of evidence brought them closer to the truth, but every moment felt urgent. Holmes began crafting a plan to identify the owner of the watch. We must visit the area where this gentleman resides. If he's as fond of the company as I suspect, there will surely be others who know him, Holmes declared, already plotting their next steps. With the three boys behind him, they staked out the establishments in the area where Mary and the gentleman were last seen. Hours trickled by, their atmosphere filled with the tension of anticipation. Just as they began to think about retreating, they spotted a finely dressed man strolling confidently toward one of the taverns. There he is, Mark exclaimed, pointing. The man with dark hair and a wool coat. Let's follow him, Holmes urged, each step echoing with purpose. They trailed the gentleman deeper into the heart of Whitechapel, the city alive with soot and shadow. Chapter 10. Confrontation in the shadows. After several twists and turns, the man entered a nondescript building. Holmes motioned for Tom, Mark and Tipo to remain hidden as he approached the entrance. Stay alert, he instructed them. We need to catch him off guard. Inside, the dim light showcased the establishment as a gentleman's club, filled with smoke and hushed conversations. Holmes listened intently, trying to catch snippets of conversations that filled the air. Suddenly, a voice interrupted the murmurings. "I assure you, my dear, my priorities extend beyond mere pleasure," the man remarked, brushing aside words of another patron. Holmes could see the man better now. He was suave, composed, but also cunning. "His charm is a shield," Holmes whispered to the boys. "You must keep him away from this crowd." The decision was made. Holmes approached the man in the corner, his demeanour confident. "Excuse me, sir. I'd like to have a word." Their eyes locked, and surprise danced in the man's expression. "Holmes, you're certainly persistent." "Indeed. I have some questions about a particular matter." As Holmes extended his hand, the gentleman's eyes shifted momentarily, wary and calculating. "Do tread lightly, my dear Sherlock Holmes." Chapter 11. Uncovering Layers of Deceit. "I suspect you have a connection to the unfortunate murders in Whitechapel," Holmes accused smoothly, not breaking his gaze. The gentleman's facade cracked slightly, revealing fleeting discomfort. "I don't see what relevance that has to me," he replied coolly. "I'm merely a businessman from a respectable family." "Let's not dance around the truth," Holmes pressed. "A silver watch, a woman's despair, and now her tragic end. You need to account for your whereabouts, and sooner rather than later." Instead of responding, the businessman grinned slyly. "I admire your steadfastness, Holmes, but you'll discover I've already made arrangements. You're too late." Before Holmes could retort, the man swiftly made his escape, vanishing into the crowd of the club. Holmes motioned for Tom, Mark, and Tipo to follow suit. "After him!" he shouted, their feet pounding against the cobblestones as they pursued the retreating figure. Chapter 12. A Race Against Time. They fled through the labyrinth streets, the tension mounting as they navigated dark alleys and narrow pathways. The mysterious man darted skillfully through the shadows, but Holmes was relentless, his determination fueled by the lives of the innocent at stake. "Does he have an escape route in mind?" Tom gasped, breathless as they raced through the darkened streets. "Perhaps toward the docks," Mark suggested, recalling the area's potential for evasion. "He may believe he can board a ship and escape." "Then we must act quickly," Holmes shouted, pushing forward. The chase led them to the waterfront, where the moonlight glistened over the dark waters, hiding many secrets. They spotted the man darting toward a small vessel at the docks, his hands hastily gesturing to the crew. "Hold on, he's trying to get away," Tom exclaimed as they closed the distance. "With me," Holmes commanded, vaulting over crates and barrels, propelling them all toward their target. Chapter 13. The Final Confrontation. As they closed in, the man turned, eyes wide with the panic of being cornered. "You cannot stop me!" he shouted defiantly, his charm replaced by desperation. "Stop right there!" Holmes roared, standing firm. "You will answer for your actions." Taking a deep breath, he advanced, The lives you have taken will not remain shrouded in silence, nor will you be able to evade the consequences. But the man lunged toward an escape route. Tipo acted quickly, intercepting him and tackling him to the ground. "Got you!" he yelled, adrenaline surging. "Get off me, you fools!" the man shouted, struggling to break free until they finally restrained him. With the dawn breaking softly over the horizon, police officers arrived to take the suspect into custody. Lestrade stepped forward, eyes wide with disbelief. "Holmes, you've done it again." "This man bears answers to more than just the current upheaval," Holmes said, his facial expression carefully neutral. "There are protocols we need to follow to ensure justice prevails, but this time it will not be elusive." Chapter 14. Justice Served. In subsequent weeks, the investigation heated up. While the man was initially uncooperative, with Holmes' unyielding resolve and the testimony of Mary Ann and the others, truths about the murders were finally unlocked. Several witnesses and items, including the silver watch and the notebook with incriminating evidence found in the man's possession, painted the picture of a cold-hearted criminal. Finally, one morning, as the trio stood outside the courthouse observing the proceedings, Tom felt a surge of pride. "We did it," he said, turning to his friends. "We helped solve the case." Mark nodded. "I thought we might have gotten it over our heads there for a moment, especially chasing that man through those dark streets." "But we saw it through together," Tipo replied, grinning. "We're like a proper detective agency now." Chapter 15. New Beginnings. Shrugging off the weight of the excitement, the trio returned to Baker Street, walking through the familiar door with eager anticipation. Holmes was deep in thought, his sharp gaze trained on the morning newspaper. "You've made headlines," Holmes said, with a hint of amusement as he gestured toward the story. "The case may have resolved, but your involvement has resonated across the city." "But this is only the beginning, right?" Mark asked, looking at his friends and then back to Holmes. "There are more mysteries out there just waiting for us." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his eyes glinting. "Each adventure shapes who you will become. The world holds many enigmas, but your courage and intellect set you apart." "Whatever comes next, we'll be ready, right?" Tom added, his expression resolute. "Right," they all answered, the bond forged through investigation solidifying their commitment to future adventures. As they stepped into the sunlight, the uncertain path ahead unfurled before them, exciting and full of possibilities. With Sherlock Holmes by their side and the promise of new enigmas to explore, Tom, Mark, and Tipo felt invincible. Sherlock Holmes and the Whitechapel Murders by Ngamoko Nikora. Copyright Ngamoko Nikora.